Hello, everyone, to our listeners for the DevOps India Summit 2021. It's great to be moderating this panel today on the exciting topic of open source software. If I look at open source overall, I'm sure all of us are aware that the adoption of open source is increasing and increasing by leaps and bounds. So today we have this eminent panel of experts who come from various backgrounds. They come from tools, they come from open source, they come from implementation of these softwares, and we would like to hear their views around what exactly happens behind the scenes from an open source standpoint. Before we get started with the discussion, I would like to just go around the table and make sure all of you guys know our panel here. So we would get started with Vishnu. Vishnu, if you could just introduce yourself, and then we will move to Aaron, followed by Lakshmi and others.
Hey, thanks, Archana. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around the world who's listening to this webinar, DevOps India Summit 2021. This is Vishnu Vasudevan. I head the product for Opsera, and we are a product-based company where we build next-gen DevOps orchestration platform across toolchain automation, no-code pipelines, and unified insights. Good to meet you all.
Thank you, Vishnu. Aaron?
Hi, thanks. My name's Aaron Morton. I live in New Zealand. I work at DataStax, where I'm a field CTO. I've been involved in the open source Apache Cassandra database since 2010. I'm a committer on that open source project and on the project management committee. And at DataStax, I'm one of our field CTOs looking after open source and how that interacts with our customers.
Thank you, Aaron. Lakshmi?
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. So my name is Lakshmi Nair. I work with Synopsys as a managing principal. So Synopsys is a product company specialized in software security, SaaS, DAST, API security, DevSecOps, so on and so forth. So which kind of takes care of end-to-end security in the development lifecycle. I lead the APAC services delivery and consulting for Synopsys Software Integrity Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Vandana?
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm glad to be part of DevOps India Summit and this panel specifically. I'm one of the global board of directors at OWASP, and I'm currently serving as a vice chair. OWASP is one of the biggest communities around application security space or open source.
Thank you, Vandana. Vishal?
Hey, hi, everyone. My name is Vishal. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for SUSE based out of Singapore, and I look after the APJ and Greater China regions. So, my key function is to engage with our key customers and partner execs across the region. And I also help the company to assess, relevant industry, technology, and market trends. I've over 20 years of experience in the IT space, and half of that is in open source companies. And I'm really looking forward to this, exciting panel discussion.
Thank you. Thanks, Vishal. So I'll probably direct my first question to Aaron and Lakshmi. And if I look at what is happening in the open source today, as I said, that it started off 10 years back, there was a lot of apprehension. Large enterprises were not ready to embrace it wholeheartedly, but today that picture is flipped. It's completely changed, right? But the question still remains in the minds of CIOs, CDOs, CTOs, saying that, has it really brought in the benefits that it has hoped it would bring in, or is it still a hype? So I would like to ask that to Aaron first, and then go to Lakshmi, and then we will get other views as well. Aaron?
Sure. So my background on this is starting out in the big data world in 2010, when big data was just beginning. One of the things that happened was that the technology that was previously locked up inside of the big tech companies, that it was proprietary and created for them, started to become open source. And that's Apache Cassandra, and that's Hadoop, and those projects. That access to that primary research is a leveling of the playing field. So it allows people to get into different business areas that they couldn't have done before. You know, it's easy now to build to have 20 million users in your user database with a distributed database. And then you get the continual innovation that comes from access to the commons, to the group of people that contribute to open source. That can be a bit lumpy in terms of, you know, the quality and in terms of how frequently that gets out. But when you bring that together, it starts to create an environment where you can spin up new projects really, really quickly using the newest technology. When we look at what's happened in the COVID world, we see that being able to react quickly and start a project and not have to go through procurement, not have to do so much work for provisioning and capacity planning, getting access to faster technology quickly helped companies survive and for some to even thrive. Well, I think we can look at all the different technology sides of it, but from a business perspective, the ability to quickly try and fail or try and succeed with minimal cost overheads is really key to what's happened in the last 18 months and what's going to continue to happen for the next 18 months or more, depending on how things go, is that's the important part, right? There's no procurement. You just get going. You just get this, you get the bits and you start and you go. You can worry about the operational sides, and there's a lot of companies that can make that easier, but that's a problem that's a successful problem, right? That's once you're successful, oh no, now we've got to worry about the operational costs. Open source makes it easier to get to have the problems that people have when they're successful.
Yeah. So if I hear from you, Aaron, right, is that one, without bringing a lot of overheads, customers and the enterprises and the clients are able to experiment fast and see those results early. So that seems to be the biggest benefit out there, which open source is helping. And of course, once you have an open source community, which is kind of built it in, you have an ability to build your services on top of it. Like you took the example of Hadoop and Cassandra and those kind of databases, which wouldn't have existed earlier. So
the key here is powering innovation. That's it.
Yeah. So quick innovation, ability to tap a bigger potential out there seems to be the big kind of benefit. So Lakshmi, taking that further, do you think this is the case, or are you seeing some things different? Are you seeing this changes based on the domain that an enterprise may be operating in?
So I love one statement that Aaron made, right? So we can kind of move away from, don't worry about the procurement of this whole stuff at all, right? So that gives a lot of freedom to us, right? Freedom to use what we want within the boundaries of open source guidelines. And yeah, we'll talk about those later, but that's definitely one of the key thing that I kind of noticed from what Aaron said. From where, right, when I look back, back in early 2000s, when we had the Linux started up and PHP coming up on board and so on and so forth, right? So if you look at the overall landscape of how the open source usage adoption changed over the number of years, like 2007 to today, there is a drastic increase in the percentage of third-party code that is being used by the organization versus how much is the in-house or the custom in-house code that organizations have developed. So that also sees that an adoption of open source kind of reduces the load on developers, helping them to focus more on the stuff which is more important to them, rather more spending their time on innovation, spending their time on customization, rather than looking at the base code for the working prototypes, right? And then adding to that, moving a little more from the Hadoop and big data, boom to the last few years, we'll be talking about the cloud adoption, and the APIs are on the boom. And a lot of it, if you look at the development community, a lot of this is now driven primarily by the open source usage, right? So how fast you can develop in a cloud setup, for example, if I look at a GCP or for example, I look at an AWS, there are numerous stuff that you can still leverage from them. And there are, and if I look at the usage of Git in itself, GitHub in itself, the usage and the people who are leveraging GitHub has increased multifold in the last couple of years. That in itself is showing that there is a lot of usable stuff there which developers can use, and also integrating a lot of it into your DevSecOps. DevOps chain is going to are helping the developers in using these available open source repository intelligently and also sensibly these days. Yeah, that's a shift that I see. Rather than using everything free from the market that was there earlier, now people are moving more into using the open source code, open source repository more sensibly and wisely.
Thanks, Lakshmi. So both Lakshmi and Aaron have spoken favorably about open source. I want to kind of ask the flip question, especially to Vishnu and Vishal, and see that is everything good in open source? I mean, is it seen as a threat by commercial tool providers who are coming up in the market with newer solutions, right? Because if I look at the company, Vishnu, that you come from, Opsera, it's coming up with newer solutions in the DevOps space, SRE space, and trying to do it. Do you see open source being a threat to whatever profitability and all that you guys could have made if this didn't exist?
We definitely don't see that as a threat. Like, in fact, like the tools that we offer as part of our product, it's completely open source, right? And open source is going to be the product-led growth. Any product company, you have to use open source in the backend. Other advantages like the knowledge that is going to come from the community is going to be huge. And you try to build any proprietary tools or proprietary open source libraries, what's going to happen is it's going to live within the small development team, like 10, 15 people or maybe 100 people. But like tomorrow, if you want to scale it, that's where you will run into the problem. But like in case of open source, you have the advantage, but there is a disadvantage as well, like in terms of the security. And you need to make sure that like you're putting the right open source tools or the libraries into the system, right? Like with respect to the vulnerabilities or the malware that's being introduced. And you need to make sure that like you have a shift left approach on any open source that you build. So like you are confident, like you will be confident like any code that goes into production. Otherwise, you might have to spend more money or like bring in more consultants to see how you can rectify the open source vulnerabilities and malware that is in production.
Okay, so you see it more as helping the community, not as a threat.
Absolutely. Like I'm all about open source. Like I've been in the DevOps space, so.
Fair enough. Vishal, how about you? What's your view there?
So, the company that I work for, SUSE, I would say that it is one of the first companies that pioneered open source. In 1992, I would say that was when Linux went mainstream, right? In 1992. Our entire business model is based on open source. But I think there is still a gap in the general understanding of what open source really means, because there are two parts to it, right? There is open source, where your communities come together, they co-create and they create new innovation, and I call that the experimentation ground, right? What is the sole objective of that of the communities is to drive new innovation. But what is there available in communities in upstream cannot be necessarily safe for consumption in mission critical environments. I'll give an example. Water is available everywhere, right? But why do we pay $1 or $2 to an Evian? Why? It's still the same water. It is because of the additional assurance that you get. And this is where vendors like SUSE come into the picture. Because whatever we offer, it's out there in the open. It's out there in the open. But what we give you is the guarantee, the assurance that when you use a solution from us, we have tested it, you have your backs covered, and if there are vulnerabilities that you find or you experience, we'll be able to help you resolve that very quickly. Vis-a-vis, if you are just taking something from the open source communities and using, it's going to be very difficult. So I think this is where the attitudes of enterprises need to change. It shouldn't be that open source is free, it is cheap, it's easily accessible, let's use it. That is great until something bad happens. And we have a lot of cases out there how companies have been badly burned. But I think things are changing, and a lot of the larger companies are realizing the value in getting a support or a subscription from an enterprise company. So I'll give some data to basically prove substantiate this. So we recently published a report. SUSE published a report called "Why IT Leaders Are Choosing Open," and we surveyed close to 800 leaders across the globe, and 80% of the respondents said that open source is really helping them to drive innovation, and that by that I mean commercial enterprise grade open source. And a lot of them are also looking at moving from proprietary to enterprise open source solutions. So I think that is my perspective, my point of view, that while open source is great, one needs to take make a cognizant choice when it comes to really using open source in mission critical environments.
Thanks, Vishal. And extending on that part, going to Vandana, where you made a statement, Vishal, saying that people are looking for that assurances that if something bad happens, who is going to kind of take the blame of that bad thing, right? So coming to Vandana, given that you are part of OWASP standards, there's a lot of companies which look at compliance of the standards, adoption of the standards. Do you see a trend where these standards have come more into existence because our open source adoption has increased? Or do you see that these standards existed and open source is kind of trying to comply to it? Where do you see the trend moving towards?
So actually, yes and a no for that, because everyone has a different viewpoint on it. So if I take it from a perspective, like everyone has started adopting open source, enterprises who were actually scared of using open source, now they're trying to adopt. The simple reason is that they can just pick up the base and start cooking the pizza that they actually need. Another point comes is the toppings that they start using. Now, if the toppings are rotten, and they'll start using, the pizza would go bad. Like, as everyone knows, like the Equifax breach, which was a huge hit. Till now, when we are speaking about it, that means everyone still goes back to the Apache thing, which was vulnerable and people were using it. So standards are there, people are trying to adhere to them, but what I still see is that they are being seen as a checklist. Okay, this is a checklist, let's go ahead and tick it. And when something is a checklist, we do it and forget about it. And that's what a human nature is. If I give a checklist to a child, what they do, they'll just cram it, speak it out, and be done with it. That's what I've seen. Similarly, for any organization, if they consider the compliance standards as just a checklist, then things will go haywire. We have seen in the case of GDPR, we have seen in the case of CCPA, or maybe any other act or bill that we talk about around privacy. Now comes a point with the open source. Now, open source is coming up with a vision that we are going to help the larger community. Then comes security angle. So there are angles which are baked into it, but that will take time because it cannot be done in one day because it's huge. And think about the whole code that we have in an organization. 80 to 90% of the code that we use in any of our application is open source. When that much code is open source, we need to consider how we can maintain our enterprise application library, how we can maintain which all libraries or which all version of open source are we going to use. Is it easy? I don't feel so. It's not that easy. We say that it looks easy, even though there are organizations which are doing the hard work in getting up systems, softwares, which can actually track all of it. But it's still going to take us a lot of time to build that system, which is complying to the standards, which is making sure that all the open source is being tracked. And if a vulnerable version is there, they can update it on time rather than just using it, because patching is also not so easy, saying that, oh, there is a vulnerable version and I'm going to patch it. You need to test it, you need to roll out, and you need to see how much it is affecting the other libraries, others open source components. Because one vulnerable open source component which you fix might make the other component vulnerable. So you have to look at the holistic picture and then complete the whole picture. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, thanks, Vandana. Now, we've heard you guys talk about the open source, how is it impacting the enterprises, what is happening in the community, the support you're getting, all of that, right? I want to ask a little different question, more oriented towards the people. And it could be my perception, so please feel free to correct it if that's not the case. But moment I look at an open source overall, I see there's a lot of trolling that happens in the community. Trolling may be probably a little bit harsh word, but there's a lot of these developer communities who are quick to let down things if they are not going good, right? So I've also seen that there's a hesitancy from enterprises if they truly believe in something and they want to make it open source. The quick thing that first goes in their mind is, if I put it out there and God forbid some small thing goes wrong, you will see a whole lot of chain of trolling that starts happening, saying this is not working, that is not working, and it kind of directly affects the brand of a company or of an individual if he or she has put it out there. So do you think this is really a case which is letting developers think twice before they start contributing to the community? And if so, we as leaders who feel so strongly about it, what do you think we should do? You could start with Vishnu and then we will go around the table. I would really want to hear about this from each and every one, because this is something which is, I feel it's important.
So yeah, I would take the example of social media, right? Like, look at Facebook. You post anything, you try to like post something about someone, there'll be a lot of trolling coming in initially. But eventually the trolling will stop and the contributions, the actual facts, the actual help will come into the system. That's what it's exactly happening with open source as well. The moment you launch, there are people who will try to break the product, and there will be people who will come and support to make the product. For example, take the Dogecoin. You know what happened to the Dogecoin? It was a coin that was created as a joke, but like last 1 year, it has been like, I don't know, like it has gone from like 5 cents to 75 cents at a point of time, and Elon Musk is pushing Dogecoin, right? That's what is going to happen. Maybe it may take some time, but eventually you will get the help, the trolling will stop. And that's how it has been like last 10 years, pretty much any open source that has come into the market so far.
Okay. Aaron, how about you?
I think there's an argument that companies, enterprises, they don't just choose open source based on the technology. You choose open source based on the community and the governance of the project. Right? To paraphrase, no one ever gets sacked for choosing an Apache project, right? Instead of for choosing IBM. So projects that have healthy communities are the projects that innovate, are the healthy projects that get chosen and selected. There is a little bit of evolution that goes on. If a community can't self-govern, and that's the contributors, the committers, the new users that come along, if they can't self-govern and form like the critical mass of health in that community, the project won't be successful. There's an incentive built in for that self-governance. Now, if you've got people coming from outside the project who have no intention other than bad to try to damage it, that's a difficult thing. You know, every community, every ASF project has had its time where the community feels a little sick. The important part is that it is in the best interest of every open source project out there to reach that level of community health and governance, whether that's ASF, Linux, CCNF, whatever it is. And that's a mark of maturity, which is really what that acceptance is into the governance program, is you're a healthy place. And that's what we've agreed on as the check mark to say, to use the water analogy, this is open source Avium. Right, this has some level of health to it, and you can ingest that rather than just picking off, hey, Bob made this and uploaded it last week, and I've never met Bob, but this looks like some cool stuff. Why don't we bait the company on it? Right, we're not doing that. So,
thank you, thanks, Aaron. Lakshmi.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Arun and Vishnu on this viewpoint, right? So open source is not about just using something free coming out from everywhere, right? So it's also about using it responsibly. So I know that, as you rightly said, Rachna, there is a lot that could be trolled, right? So there a lot that could be picked up. For example, the Equifax breach, or maybe if you can look at even the SolarWinds one that happened, right? So there were components that were not really being put in and unmonitored altogether, and we are talking about, hey, this is bad. The OSS is not something that we should be using, or rather using so widely as it should be. But yeah, the fact is that it is all about putting together the right governance framework. When the developers want to use open source, it's about not just downloading, or okay, I found something out there, it's a really cool thing and it can do wonders. So beyond that, there should be a responsible way of, okay, how do we put together a process in which, how do we evaluate, how do we make sure that it could be patched at a later stage, and it won't be a dormant component that will be there in your product for years, and that could become a potential attack point for hackers to leverage at a later stage, right? So putting all those pieces together, making it the evaluation process to see if that is something that we could use as an organization for a product that goes out the market to be sold. That's point number one. Second aspect, while we do that, it is also important that we put together a process, or rather a scanning and security evaluation process, not just security, I would say all about the licensing aspects as well, to evaluate the repercussions. How do we see that some of these components could have next level of license issue at a later stage, right? So all those things could be put together as a process and a framework in place. And when I say framework, it is not something that people have to go through multiple checkpoints, do that checkbox thing. No, it has to be governed through technology. For example, something like open source scanning platforms like we have Synopsys has Black Duck, and Snyk we have seen similar thing. White Source is another tool. So a lot of different tools are there to do this kind of validation before we put that out for developers for use. So that's my viewpoint, Archana. So it's also about responsible usage of open source.
Thanks, Lakshmi. Yes, Vishal. Trolling and open source. What do you think we should do to stem it, or make sure etiquettes are followed?
Yeah, to be honest, I've been in the open source world for 20 years, and first time I've heard the word trolling, and I would refrain from using that term. And I'd like to look at open source communities as a playground where people decide by themselves whether they want to participate or not. It's a democracy, right? And to your question, what is keeping enterprises away from open source? What are some of the queries or doubts or concerns that they have before they participate? And I think there were some great points brought up that not everything is rosy. It is like after trying out something for 1,000 times, you get the light bulb. And it is pretty similar out there in the open source space. They can be a hit or a miss. Because if you look at GitHub, you will find practically so many new projects springing up every other month. A lot of them may never see the day of the light of the day, and they will be canned, right? But that should not deter a vendor from not participating and effectively not innovating. Because some of the most popular projects that you see today, they just didn't come out just out of nowhere. They were evolutions of many past projects that didn't really make it because they lacked some capabilities. So I think that is something that enterprise vendors, commercial vendors need to take note of and approach open source with an open mind. But don't stop the innovation. Don't stop collaborating. You will have the naysayers who may not believe what you are doing. But I think in order for open source to continue to succeed, there's one thing that everybody needs to do, and that is to continue contributing, continue participating. And the more committers, contributors, and active participation that you have in open source communities, that will only not just help you drive the credibility that you bring to the industry, but you will also be able to influence the roadmap of projects, right? Because if you look at how open source works, there are going to be a lot of independent committers, there's going to be companies. And if you want to really drive the roadmap and influence the roadmap of the projects, you got to be actively contributing. So I think approach open source with an open mind. It's not all rosy, but we should still continue, because that's the only way that we are going to be able to continue to innovate.
Sure. Thanks, Vishal. Vandana, do you think standard bodies like yours should play a role in these kind of governance, or should they stay away from it and let the community take its own course?
Okay, I'm totally in line with what Vishal said. And specifically, if I talk about the communities like OWASP, which are there, because OWASP has multiple projects which are open source. Specifically, if I talk about tools itself, which are all open source. Now, when that much of code is open source, it becomes even more important that we have contributors, we have volunteers who are helping. And there is one point to remember with these open source technologies that organizations are using, that's being developed by volunteers in their in their free time, or when they are actually volunteering, spending their time. So there will be few things which will be left out, which is like a basic understanding, which is like unsaid truth, which is with everyone. But everyone is trying their best to make sure that these things are fulfilled. And what I have seen with the project leaders, specifically around open source, that they try and innovate around it. They give sleepless nights to make sure that the project comes out. They're spending time to make sure that more people come in. Now, I am not sure about trolling, but yes, there are a few negative words that do come into picture. But I think when people are talking behind you or saying negative things, that means there is a space wherein you can do better, innovate, and enhance it. So instead of taking it that, okay, there are things which are negative with it, let's work towards making it more positive. Because if it's volunteer driven, that means it needs help. So instead of saying that, oh, this is a bad project, this is not right with it, if you know that this is the way that you can make it right, okay, let's contribute. That's the simple way. And not just in the form of code, but maybe in the form of something with the language enhancement. I have seen some great projects coming up in the French language, in Spanish. How about somebody who knows about it and help in converting it to the native, maybe in English, maybe in any other language. Similarly, if people are enthusiastic about something and they're saying, okay, we are trying to figure out what all projects are good, what all projects are bad. So there's no good or bad project, to be very candid. There are projects which have good contributors, which have so many contributors and flourishing. And when people are getting to know about it, people are getting associated. There are not so known projects or open source components. How about people get to know and then they start helping that? That's my viewpoint on that.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Vandana. If I look at what is also happening around is these big sellouts that have happened, right? Red Hat Linux being bought by IBM almost, I think, if I'm not mistaken, $37 billion exchanged hands. You had GitHub being bought by Microsoft. And you see these big names trying to acquire certain areas and going in the open source, right? Do you think, given that whatever activity like these are happening, the open source communities also now need to think of security, legal repercussions that they may face in the future? Because at one point in time, there's these kind of acquisitions that are happening. At the other end, you see all the governments across the world tightening their regulations on tech companies. Where do you think open source community will play a role in this? Will you see contribution reducing with regulations and acquisitions and a lot of these kind of things happening? Because there's always a commercial benefit that somebody would have in mind rather than giving to a community kind of a mindset. So I would like to hear from all of you around this piece specifically as to what do you think the future holds for open source. We'll get started with you, Aaron, and then we will go around the table.
Cool, thanks. It's a tricky one. A business model that relies on obfuscating bytecode and then like putting it on a CD or shrink wrapping it or something like that is not a business model that succeeds anymore. Yeah, we've seen the canonical example of that, Microsoft, under Satya, switched from, hey, we give you a CD, roughly speaking, to, hey, can we rent you some stuff? Can we take all of the management out of this for you? Can we simplify it more and more and just make it so that you click a button and you get to do what you want? They're the business models that are winning. They're the business models that will win in the open source world, as that simplification of operations, starting projects easily, canceling them easily, and all that sort of thing. In terms of where we are with security and things, I think one of the things that open source does is it secures the patent. It secures the idea that if I use this, I could not get sued for using it. And particularly like the ASF patenting, because that's something I'm aware of from working in that space. So we take care of that. Now, the security of your network and your entire infrastructure is such a complicated beast, and the data sovereignty rules that you have to live under are such complicated things that I think they're legitimately beyond the scope of doing our best as people that make open source infrastructure to do what is the industry standard of security. But acts of omission, oh, we made a small bug here and it got exposed. Well, if you've got a persistent bad actor in your environment, that's kind of your fault. Like go secure your network. So I think the big picture of as open source is driving everything. Is there any liabilities and things? No. The point of open source is that you're protecting the patent work. You're protecting access to the ideas and the technology.
Okay, so in your mind, moment it starts going towards the liability, that may not be the best thing to happen to open source. The way it is today, it's free. When I say free, it's free for people to experiment and think, and it should remain that way and not get bogged down by regulation.
We've not seen any successful company being sued for security breach.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Thanks, Aaron. Lakshmi, what are your views? What direction is open source taking based on all these things happening around in the tech world?
Yeah, so I have a slightly different view in this space, right? So yeah, open source definitely was introduced with the right intention to cultivate innovation and promote open usage of code out there, right? But then what we also see is that when there are license obligations, there are different licensing model. For example, we talk about try to display, right to copyright, right to modify. All of this are part of different type of licenses that we see in the open source world today, right? Maybe it's public domain or proprietary license, all of this, right? So while all of this exists, then we can't just say that, yeah, we would like to stick to a very open world of using open source. It is open, but it is not really open enough for anybody to use the way that they want. There are repercussions on modifying, displaying, copying, distributing the code as such, right? So, and the other aspect, when we see that with multi-cloud adoptions in the last few years, we see that enterprises going on multi-cloud adoptions, right? And then we see that there are aspects related to a lot of open source stuff available. Especially, I would like to take example of databases, right? So you would see a lot of them, like Postgres available, there are MongoDBs available. So a lot of this is available. And then how do we make sure that we choose the correct one? How do you leverage the correct technologies for your data analytics needs when you are moving to a multi-cloud environment? That also becomes a very pertinent question in this space, right? So and while we have a lot of players out there who are offering open source options, maybe in the form of a containerized environment, people can just pick up and use it. A couple of stuff that we need to or developers or enterprises will have to take care of when we are distributing open source is one, how do we make it interoperable, right? How do we ensure the interoperability aspect of it? Because licensing definitely plays a separate role, but interoperability on how we can use that within different environments, not just one environment which was originally designed for. So that plays an important role when we are moving from single cloud to multi-cloud and also to diverse platforms these days. The second aspect are about clear licensing guidelines. While it is still open, how do we make people aware as a enterprise? How do we make people aware that what are the restrictions in using, copying, distributing the code that is out there in public? So that will reduce a lot of dependencies. People can refer to that and then get going as they want. And definitely security is something that I've been talking all in my previous responses as well, because that's closer to me. Security is another factor which is of very obvious reasons that we see in terms of the recent breaches. How do we make the code available free of security vulnerabilities? So these are certain some of the factors that I think vendors should start considering to stay relevant in this space.
Okay, thanks Lakshmi for that. Vishnu, how would you say your thoughts are in terms of the future for the open source, given the tighter regulations happening around? Do you think it will affect the open source or not really? They would still be able to thrive and continue the way they are?
See, the future is going to be open source 100%, right? Like we are already seeing in terms of the web, the mobile, and the cloud solutions that are coming with respect to the Kubernetes, right? And these are all like built predominantly on open source infrastructure, like 99%, 98%. And like even if you look at some of the data analytics solutions that is available in the market, it's available only in the open source. Like it's very difficult for anybody to go buy the product and then like relying on them to give them the upgrades and all those things. So open source is going to be the future for us, and that's what it's going to drive the digital transformation. Like especially like post pandemic, it has picked up now, and it is going to pick up more pace, and it is also going to evolve in the AI space as well, like next 2 to 3 years. That's how I see it.
Thank you. Thanks, Vishnu. Vishal, any thoughts from your side on this topic?
Yeah, I'd like to mention 2 points. First, I'd like to pick off from what Lakshmi mentioned. She mentioned interoperability, and that's very important. So you also, Archana, you talked about large companies acquiring open source companies, and I mean, if you look at my background, I have been part of such a major acquisition. I think one of the threats that I see to open source, it's around ethos. If you look at open source, it's not just about contributing and consuming, it's also about giving back. So what I mean by that is, I'll take SUSE as an example. We build operating systems, we build container management solutions, we do innovation in the upstream communities, but even internally, we have engineers that will build patches, that will fix vulnerabilities, that will enhance the code. Then we will contribute back to the community. Obviously, there'll be time delay, but that is the ethos. We don't just consume, we also give out. The second thing that we also ensure is that while for some of these projects, SUSE as a company may be the primary company with most contributors, but that does not mean that when we build solutions, it will only work with our own stack. We make a deliberate and conscious effort to ensure that it will work with all of the other commonly used environments and platforms, to the point that Lakshmi brought up, which is interoperability. And this is a trend that I'm observing. It's a trend where there are vendors who are completely open source, but they're not truly open source, meaning it's a solution that is built on open source technologies. But if you want to swap, for example, an operating system to another operating system, it's not going to be supported. So this will bring you back to the olden days of proprietary world, where you will be safe as long as you use my stack. Now it takes on a different form, it's open source, but it's all about the ethos. So I think vendors need to take a different approach, and as much as possible, try to ensure that whatever you create is interoperable, so that consumers can easily swap solutions as and when they like. The second point I want to add to what Aaron brought up, which is that when we look at open source, there are a lot of things which is really not in the hands of the principal vendor or the contributors. It is going to be outside. So I'll quote one very good one example that made a lot of news a couple of years back. And this is something, there was this vulnerability that was discovered, two vulnerabilities, processor level vulnerabilities called Meltdown and Spectre. And it's a hardware level vulnerability, which will basically allow hackers to steal data as it's being processed in the CPUs. And that will impact a lot of the vendors, primarily vendors who are building operating systems, solutions that are designed to run on these processors. So is this, who should take responsibility? Should it be the microprocessor vendor? Should it be the operating system vendor? So it's a bit tricky. But a lot of the vendors, for example, SUSE, we quickly worked with the community, the Linux community, to come out with a patch and make it available and to address this type of vulnerabilities. So it can be a bit tricky and dicey because there are so many different points, and how can we piece all these things together, because it may not be within our jurisdiction a lot of times.
Sure, thanks, Vishal. So a question to Vandana, that with all these things around security coming in and OWASP being in the forefront of setting those standards, do you as a person who's governing many of these standards body feels that you as a standards needs to have bigger say out there in terms of deciding the liability, deciding what would it mean in case these standards were violated? So one is giving out the standards. Second is also saying if these standards not followed, what kind of liable things you are. And do you think your bodies like yours should be consulted when governments set out these kind of rules to do it?
So I have a very different take on that. Specifically, if I talk about OWASP Top 10, OWASP Top 10 was picked up by PCI and they started using as part of it, wherein if you follow through PCI, it says that you should be compliant with OWASP Top 10.
Yes.
So when you talk to the leaders, it is not a standard. It is more of a framework. It is a kind of a benchmark. It is a kind of a setting stage thing, which you can pick up and start using it. It is not the whole thing that, okay, if I am compliant with OWASP Top 10 and I am done with it. No, there are vulnerabilities which are still there and which still exist based on the organization need, based on the standard need. It should be used. Another important aspect comes is that when the organizations are using these standards, they need to understand that till what extent they're going to be using. And if it's just because they are a medicine organization or like a healthcare organization, so they are using HIPAA, but what else? Because if we are just using these compliances and we are saying that, oh, we are good, no, it is never going to suffice, because standards are there. They're going to give you the baseline. They'll always give you, and they openly say that we are here to give you the baseline, to make sure that you understand these are the things which are needed as part of maybe PCI, HIPAA, or any other standard. But you will have to extend based on what your organization needs. Because what I have also heard from organizations saying, oh, we are compliant with PCI, we are compliant with HIPAA, and we are secure. No, you're not. This is just to make sure that we are not losing on items. We are not losing on things. We are not losing on data. Specifically now when we say data is the new oil, and if it starts spilling everywhere, we're going to be in loss. Similarly, these standards say the same thing, but what we need to do, we need to pick up, start using, and then extend it and comprehend to a level wherein it suits our security needs, rather than just saying, oh, we are using this and we are good. So there are multiple perspectives that different people have on this.
Thank you. Thanks, Vandana. So if I look at the different views that you as a panel have shared and try to summarize a couple of things, right? We started with talking about the benefits that open source has given us so far. Aaron started off speaking about benefits in terms of playground to do innovation, talking about things you can use open source libraries and start moving things faster. Then we heard you, Vandana, talking about the pizza, and I still remember it can give you the pizza base, but if you put rotten toppings on top, no amount of open source compliances and anything is going to stop you from being your pizza rotten, right? It will be a bad software that you are developing. We did hear about the overall open source contribution that is happening within enterprises, where both Vishal and Vishnu spoke about how their organizations are using underlying open source to make sure there's a certain assurance provided to their clients to say that whatever is in open source is of a certain level, certain standards, and we take that responsibility to make sure if something goes in your organization south, we as a company will help you out to recover from it. And then of course we had Lakshmi speaking about what is happening from a tooling standpoint. So overall, I would say as a community, we all seem to be gung-ho about open source. We all seem to be saying that that is going to stay. But one thing I would like to also say that all of us talked about is that do it responsibly, I would say is the word, to make sure that whatever you are putting out there, you are truly contributing to the community and not pulling anyone down. I think that's the most important that we as software professionals need to adhere to. So with that note, I would like to thank our eminent panel today. Exciting discussions, exciting topic, and I hope to again converse with all of you around this topic in the upcoming summits and the future opportunities that we might get as well. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, Archana. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.